Many thanks, Eric. Many thanks to all participants for this exciting second panel. Now, I have the special honor of warmly welcoming Franz Erhard Walter to the exhibition, personally and in flesh. Despite from the special circumstances, you have come to see the exhibition for the last time, which will only be installed here at Haus der Kunst until tomorrow. And to enter into a dialogue with our audience and the participants, albeit virtually via streaming instead of physically. Dear Franz, welcome.
Thank you.
We were very pleased that you have come and are available for question and answers with our audience. So, how are you doing?
I'm fine, in good condition. I'm relaxed, so we can start.
Great. May I ask you, how is it for you now to be here in this closed exhibition?
A little bit of sadness. It was a wonderful show. I think a show like this I won't have for a long time. It's unique, I think. So, as I said, a little bit of sadness. It's very emotional, sorry.
Yeah, sure, for sure.
And of course, all these months, I didn't have the chance to come here because of this corona shit. So I saw in the beginning, of course, for a long time. And all the month, when I haven't seen it, I had it so precisely in mind, every detail. So and often, by imagination, I was strolling through the show. I think you too.
Yeah. Maybe let's pick up, you said sadness. So this streaming festival was created in the spirit of the work you produced during the first lockdown in the context of this exhibition. And it's called Anwesenheit, Presence, and an actual projection of a language piece on the west facade of Haus der Kunst. And we would like to be present in absence. And would you allow me to briefly summarize both panels for you and also our online community who were unable to follow both panels so far. So the first panel with Catherine Butt, Gregor Quack and Gaetan Werner was about what your work does to people but also to the museum. And to what extent, since the post-war period, you have become a pioneer here for changed art historiography. Big word.
It's very touching. Thank you.
Yeah, I would say how you confront the limits of classical narratives, for example, disciplinary limits that stem from Western modernism, with your initial unusual choice of materials and practice. Involving people, inviting them to take action, and to develop also a space of freedom, as Gaetan Werner called it, and to actively influence the world and people's encounters. Of course, you have not been described as an activist artist, but your art allows us to look at ourselves and our surroundings and our actions in the environment in a very different way. You make us active. So the role of material as a driver of economics, but also as a driver of rebellion was discussed. Fabric become a connector for people and society, for participation and freedom. It was also stated how strong these central themes in your work actually are, and even determine our society today in the digital sphere. In the age of a post-internet generation, where it is about networks and also open sources. How you have reflected on the body and the object, the material and the immaterial in this process. So the relationship between the body and the object as a starting point, but also how you have shaped a new image of the artist in the 20th century. Beyond decades of old Western idea of the male genius?
Oh, many questions at the same time. But first, there was a special situation at the end of the 50s where all this started. My desire was to extend the idea of work that's not only inherent of a shaped thing, maybe painting or sculpture, but I also thought of how to incorporate the former spectator He shouldn't be only a spectator, he should turn into an actor. So I had developed works which made this possible, making the body part of the work, or even the body as work. It was quite a thing to think that way at the end of the 50s, beginning of the 60s.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I had some terms which were very important for me, like informel. So I was strongly related to the art of informel for the sake of more the term informel than the penis itself. Informel meant for me, art can't be without form and shape. It's impossible. But if we claim that the artwork doesn't have form, it's informel, what does that mean? Without form, without shape, formless, that can't be. So I thought of if those paintings, it was related to painting, if they have just a structure, a rhythm, no composition anymore, I have to imagine the idea of image in it, a project in it. So that means I have to take part and I have to act. So the whole thing starts with this simple idea that happened in Frankfurt at Städelschule, which was a funny thing at the situation, where it was being discussed at that time whether abstract is a matter which is valid to work with in the academy.
Yeah, I see. Would you allow me briefly to summarize also the second panel with Yasmil, Erik, Christian, and Gregory? Your work was discussed with regard to the aspects of hybridization and media expansion, also by means of temporal and local parameters. The differences to the practice of the modernists as well were clearly highlighted in the context of subjectivity and objectivity, functionalism and formalism, also pretty interesting. At the same time, your choice of materials, like fabric of course, is also understood as a very political decision. Because you would so dismantle the ego trip of those big guys in the 1960s. A form of neo-feminism is emerging from it, said Yasmil. As well as the shifting from object to image, from image to object, as Erik said. And the movement of the body also plays a central role here, since it is from this movement that the situations are founded or unfolded. Image as choreography, image as film still. I know you wouldn't agree, as Jasmine said, but also the action that unfolds acting independently instead of acting non-independently, which we are supposed to do normally in our societies. And Christian Rathemeyer sees in this that you get people to make a choice to participate or not, for example.
Well, sure.
And participation or non-participation is already a great democratic quality in your work, in his opinion. All in all, you were assumed to have more pictorial than object-based strategies compared to minimal art, for example. Your decision to hide or redefine the site of the institution as such during conception was considered both anarchic and as form of brilliant institutional critique, and that you founded something like a new relationship that you have established between, of course, recipients, producer, and the work itself. We will now turn our attention to questions that the panel participants have asked you. We now hear the first question by Catherine Wood, senior curator at Tate, and she moderated the first panel.
Well, hello to Franz. We wish you were here too, or we wish we were there, and greetings from Tate Modern. It's been a real pleasure to be reading the catalogue that's been produced on your work and talking to Gregor and Gaetan, and looking at your work again on display at Tate today, sadly empty of visitors at the moment, but it really made me think about how, since the earliest work of yours when you would be in the gallery, say in 1969 in New York, and demonstrating how people should participate, and these questions of people feeling either intimidated or wanting to do it their own way or needing to be shown. I wondered if you could describe in words the kind of mood or attitude that people should bring to the action. People sometimes associate participation with a playfulness, but I see it as a much more kind of ceremonial approach. And I wonder if there are specific words you would use to describe an attitude to partaking in the action of your works.
First, in the beginning of the 60s, my artist activities, they seemed to be so far away from the art world, and they were being used terms which had nothing to do with it. So I insisted that it is part of the art world. And before we talked about the question of material. I choose material, which is quite important, fabric, because that hadn't been used before in the art world. That made me free from history first. Then, of course, the question was there, as an artist, I need material. And this, the fabric, is just material which has to function in the activation. So the second idea was, if I act or we act, what's the status of the body in time and space? Next definition was that I had to think that the body itself could be seen as material, as well as the time, the real time, which is being created in action, or I define it in action, and also time. Time can be structured, can be articulated in this activation. To claim that these things could be seen as material at the moment, it was, I speak of the early years in the 60s, that was explosive in the art world. Maybe it's not a real answer, but was one of my questions on the beginning. The other thing was that I spoke always of work. Of course I was aware of that the work can't be of fragments, it has to be an entity. But nevertheless, my activation or my art concept that was fragmented. I had the pieces. When they were in a storage situation, you could dress them as artworks in a traditional way. But when you activate them, you turn them into a kind of implement, one thing. Then when you act, there's a thing in itself. It exists in time. It has a starting and an end. And what about the memory? I want to keep up, I want to note down the experience, the ideas, the conceptions which originated in the activation. So I developed a corpus of drawings, which I called in the beginning diagrams and later on work drawings. So the idea of work did exist of all these elements, which at that time seemed to be very strange. And I never forget this remark of an elder wise man who said, Walter, this is not a thing artists can do. That's a thing for theater and music, working with real time. Art that has to transform it, make it symbolic, allegoric, and so on. So I had to deal with all these questions. I had no artist friends as supporters. I have to say, it's a little bit very alone at that time.
Okay, thank you so much. Shall we listen to Catherine's second question?
Another question was related to the notion and the title of your show at Wiels and Elena Filipovic's fantastic essay, The Body Decides. And I was thinking about Yvonne Rainer's The Mind is a Muscle, and this question of what it means to try to suppress the hierarchy of the head leading the body. What happens when the body decides? What happens when bodies decide together? And it brings up questions of authorship, I guess, over a kind of instinctive action. Were you trying to suppress a hierarchy of the thinking head in relation to the body?
No, I don't suppress it, but I want just to put emphasis of the feeling of a person that they can see herself as a sculpture, potential sculpture. Therefore, I use this term. Quite easy.
Okay. The next question will come from Gaetan Werner. You did together an exhibition in 2016 at Power Plant Toronto, right? And it was called Call to Action. No,
Call to Action.
Call to Action. So let's listen to Gaetan.
Your mode of working with early on was very much a collaboration between your drawings and the work of Johanna Walter in producing the works, you know, in sewing them and working with you in order to present them. I would like you to speak about that relationship from a male-dominated, you know, era of artists and what it is to be an artist, and for you to openly engage with a woman such as Johanna as an equal partner in your production of work. And can you speak about this perception between the use of material link to let's say women's craft or women's work, and you deciding to use this material within your practice?
I never thought in those terms. I think I mentioned it before. I choose the material fabric for a simple reason, to step out of history concerning the material which had been used in art history. So with the idea of that acting could be part of the work, I had also to find not only the material, another material which hadn't been used before, but also the technique of sewing, you know. Before that was always in the world of craftsmanship at home. So I was free of this heavy bondage to history. So I had a certain freedom with this material. And it also did allow me dimensions which were not possible with the technique I had before. I did glue the pieces. Gluing the pieces did limit the size first. And there was always, that disturbed me, the connotation of collage. So with this, it was too close connected to history. And this sewing that was at the time completely free, since, as I said, was not a technique being used in the art world. So, but I never connected it with women's work or stuff like this. I was surprised to hear this later on, but it was not in my mind.
So I'm also very interested in the subject that Gaetan raised, obviously, and how does it feel for you that your practice could be contextualized within an increased, let's say, reappraisal of the significance of key feminist artist positions, for example, from the 1970s, from today's perspective. I mean, the current, in face of the current state of research.
But first, I forgot one thing to answer.
Sure.
When Gaetan mentioned Johanna. Johanna did all the sewing. She is a technician in textile, and that was a lucky circumstance that she was able to sew all these pieces for me. I made the layout, the design, developed form and shape, and she brought it into physical, in the physical situation. Happy thing. So if she wouldn't have been there, how to realize those works. I had to learn sewing, but I would have, but that is so, concerning time, so intensive that all these, for me, very important world of work drawings, which tell about the experience in the activation, wouldn't exist in this large number, which I think is possible. I forgot to mention that before. Now, I didn't answer your question, but
Yeah. Yeah.
you have to repeat it again.
Yeah, sure, of course. So again, so how does it feel for you that your practice could be also contextualized with an increased, let's say, reappraisal of significance of key feminist artists, especially from the 1970s?
Like
from
whom?
Today's perspective.
Like whom?
We brought up names during the panels like Zenga Ningudi, for example, from the US.
I have to comment, I don't know her. I know soon works by Lucia Clark, a few things, some smaller in size, they're quite beautiful. If she did large things, for me it was kind of Rio Carnival. Very funny, I don't know. Very ambivalent work. I started with using fabric and the technique of sewing in the end of 62, beginning of 63. There was no other artist, I thought, or all the other people around me thought, there's no other artist, this strange, funny work, which can't be part of the art world, applied art. And then we learned about the work of Claes Oldenburg. He was the one who did, I thought, legitimate working with fabric. So that was the only one, and we saw the first work, I think, can't remember, maybe in the beginning of 63. And before, the artist friend, they always made jokes about me. Now he turns to a tailor, he will become a tailor. Funny stories were being told about this. And then at the moment when Claes Oldenburg became known, it was silent.
I see. Okay.
Only then.
Yeah, thank you very much for the answer. Now we will listen to Gregor Quack, who is studying at Yale University with Pamela Lee.
Hi, Franz. It's been a great pleasure to speak with everyone, with Gaetan and with Catherine about your work today. I have a question as someone who's currently working on their dissertation. I'm reading a lot. There's so much new scholarship about your work coming out, and so many new ideas. And so my question is, what are aspects of your own work that you never knew about that have been discovered by other people in the recent years? Because you've spoken about how maybe your work wasn't fully legible back in the 50s and 60s, and that it is now. So what are some of the things that have become legible and that we can now read that you maybe didn't even know about? And in conjunction to that, how has your attitude changed to other people's interpretations of your work? Are you more permissive of allowing ideas about your work that you maybe didn't come up with in the beginning, or have you always been that way?
In my generation, or the time when these works had been developed, there was no adequate language to describe it. So there were terms applied which didn't belong to it, and often with terms which has nothing to do with the artwork. And I had insisted that what is part of the artwork, nevertheless, that I wanted to step out. So language was missing, and there was a kind of helplessness. They were making jokes about me. That has dramatically changed in the last, I would say, 15 years, 20 years. First, that artists which were younger than me took up this conception of work activations, acting with objects first. And then they took on this concept widely, and often now they use this material, which is difficult. But of course, for me, it's a kind of honor that a new generation of young artists take on this work concept, which had been developed decades before. Meanwhile, your generation, Gregor, they have, it's my feeling, also Jana, you have an adequate language to describe it. So I feel for the first time, since a few years, the first time that my work concept is really being understood. That was not possible at the time, as I said, when I started. There was a heavy, rejection of it. That disappeared. Meanwhile.
Yeah, now we will hear the questions from the participants of the second panel. And we will start with Gregory Williams. He's teaching at Boston University. And what is your connection again to Gregory?
He has a big understanding of my work concept.
Okay, awesome.
And by the way, and it's funny with him, we speak German together. He lived for a long time in Germany.
Okay, I see.
But his understanding is, for me, it's very important, the way he addresses my work.
Hallo Franz, ich freue mich hier dabei zu sein und schade, dass wir uns nicht wieder sehen. Das war toll, dass wir uns im März getroffen haben und ja, das schade, dass das Ende so geworden ist, aber dass wir alle wieder zusammenkommen können, auch virtuell, ist ein Riesenvorteil. And my questions are, I guess I'll just start with one about, we were talking about the titles in your work and changes to the titles over time. I'm particularly interested in how some of your titles for the work set objects changed, particularly in 1982. And if you could say a little bit about how you think about titling of those works over time, that would be great. And then I'll ask just a big messy question and just say, what is the role of utopia in your work?
Well, first, the change of titles has simply to do with my experience I had with the work activation. On the beginning of, it is rather sober, this naming of the pieces, and later on, let's say, content, meaning of it flows into it. That's a change. And I think and sometimes it becomes simpler, the formulations of in the beginning biographical, and then later on, they were more related to the art world, I think. That was the first. And the second question was?
What role plays utopia in your work?
A big one, of course, a very big one. I want to invent the art world new, the art new. I want to create a new idea of sculpture, of defining time and space, have another look at the person, try to turn the spectator into an actor. It was a big thing. That was utopia, I think. Sorry.
Now we will hear Christian Rathemeyer's question. He wrote also a meaningful essay on your work and emphasized, I would say, the meaning of painting for your work.
Okay.
Hallo, lieber Franz. Es ist so schade, dass ich heute nicht persönlich in München sein kann, aber es freut mich, dass deine Eröffnung meine letzte Reise nach Deutschland war, bevor wir alle im Lockdown eingeschlossen wurden. Insofern sende ich Grüße aus New York an dich und an Susanne und an alle und freue mich, dass ich wenigstens virtuell an dieser Diskussion teilnehmen kann. Dear Franz, can you remind us what the decisions were that led you to come up with a storage form, and when you decided to abandon the storage form as a valid format for the first work set?
Well, in the beginning, when I started with this work, which could be activated, I just had the question, what do the pieces represent when they are on the floor or on a table? They never appeared on a pedestal. So you could address them as strange sculpture. But when you activate them, let's say you have pieces you take in your hand, you change the subject. And you could say, which I did, well, maybe my hands can be seen as a pedestal. So, and with this idea, not only the hands, but the whole body became part of the work. So, but the main situation concerning time was the storage situation. So storage didn't mean to pack it away, but to show it, to find a valid form which is convincing that it can be addressed as an artwork. So we have an example here, later work, that stayed during all the decades, but was there from the beginning. That had also to do with the fact that on the beginning, when I did experimenting with techniques and material, before I came to fabric, I was working with paper. The paper that was used as material to do processional work. Processional work, of course, again, rose the question, is that possible to have it in a row, to see it in a row instead in one piece? What is the original? if I initiate a process, of course, that means it can be a row. Why having an original? And the row of pieces, how to storage them. I had them on stack. Someday when I did them fold over like a book, I said, well, I fold it over, it has two sides, but how about my folding? Folding over, could this part of the work? That means handling. And with this thing, when I discovered that, I developed works which were done for, produced for activation. So there's a process behind a discovery.
Last but not least, we will hear a question.
Is that okay?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay.
Okay, I repeat myself. Last but not least, we will hear a question from Eric, the moderator of the second panel.
Lieber Franz, wir vermissten dich natürlich alle und wir sind alle traurig, dass wir jetzt nicht alle zusammen in München sind. Ich hätte eine Frage in English. Franz, the idea of exhibiting at the Haus der Kunst has been a source of unease for you for a long time, given the imposing architecture of the place and its history. Now that you have taken the plunge, what is your perspective on this experience?
The Second World War, especially the political situation, in the Nazi time, I remember from 1943 on, there were experiences which were horrible. I still remember them pretty well. And seeing, and that was the case, seeing the world falling apart, that has such a heavy impression on me. And that came to my mind only later on when I was asked by young people, how did you come to your work concept? Obviously, it didn't stem from art history, so where does it come from? And I think this seeing the world falling apart physically, that had an impression, so I lost the belief in eternal things, that things can be forever. I have to say this. I was not aware of this at the beginning, but later on, yes, because I was asked that question. That's one thing. I have an experience with the Haus der Kunst. I think it was in 1956 or 1957, there was a show, a Picasso show here. I went to Munich, I was, I think, 18 years old, to see that show exactly in this Nazi temple. And it did overcome all this. So from that moment on, seeing that show, the brown dust had disappeared for me. So I had never a real problem with it. It is, I have seen shows which didn't really deal with this architecture. I saw this, but I think in our case, it worked quite well. So it's a big experience all to see that I did overcome the history of this building.
So now we will see the last question from our panel participants. Let's listen to Yasmil.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Franz. My question for you is, did you ever think about manufacturing, mass producing the first work sets?
That was an utopia in the 60s. I couldn't realize that. It was an idea. I couldn't realize for a simple reason. First, there were no collectors or whatever to want to have the pieces, and I didn't have the money to produce them. Otherwise, I would have tried to. Nevertheless, the first work set, from a certain moment on, end of the 60s, there were a lot of collectors, also museums, interested in these work of 58 parts. And then came the idea whether to make replicas. And we decided to make 7 replicas, so the work set which I kept, and in addition 7 work sets which meanwhile belong to museums worldwide. It was a big effort, also concerning material and time investment to produce those works. But the idea was there at the time. Also for the idea of everybody should have a chance to work with these pieces. They shouldn't be unique in the sense of the original, the thing. Activation could be done. That was the main thing. The emphasis was put on the activation. And I claimed that the activation, the acting, is the artwork. And the pieces then would serve as a kind of implement, as I mentioned before. And for that reason also, we thought about doing replicas. I wouldn't say editions, but replicas.
Franz, I would suggest we will now continue with questions from our online community. Would you allow me to forward some questions?
Sure.
They're a bit different, but also highly interesting, from my opinion, from my side. First question would be, where do the fabrics you work with come from?
First in Düsseldorf, beginning of the 60s, 63, 64, we found, I don't know where, a store which did deal with remnants, with rests. So I got them rather for little money. But even that money which I had was not enough. So when there's a poor artist, I have no money, but I need it, and they made a special price for me. It was only a little bit. Then when I was in New York, we found in downtown so-called retail stores, mostly old Yiddish people coming from Europe, all the very sentimental ones. When I came there and they spoke Yiddish and I understood it, and I'll never forget this. So therefore I got rests of bales of fabric. I didn't have the money to buy the grand size. And later on, was in 69, Karl Ströer, Paul Wember, they wanted to have replicas of the whole work set. And some collectors want to have them. Then we decided to do the replicas. And we went from New York to Fulda because there it was simpler, easier to realize that, since Johanna's parents did have a tailor shop. What was I going to say with that? I lost.
Where do come the fabrics from? Maybe during your
at that time was also a funny situation. From Johanna's family, there was a guy. Well, in Fulda first there were two large factories producing fabric. And one from the family of Johanna, he said, well, if you need it, he had a huge store with bales of fabric as remnants. And that meant often a lot of material. So there I got it quite cheap, rather. Mm-hmm. And I always used material which exists already. So I didn't have the chance, and it was not necessary, let's say, to dye fabric in the color. That came later with the wall formation at the end of the 70s, where the idea of image came back. That needed color also, not only the material fabric, but also color. And fortunately, there I could afford dyed material. So I don't know, I don't remember anymore where we found this factory who could produce them. Mm-hmm. But important was on the beginning that I had to find out where could I get for little money the adequate material. Mm-hmm. Adequate material meant bright color was excluded. So the quality meant strong, thin, and I also had to have the foam rubber for padding, some of them. That was not easy to get with the little money we had. So where did it come from?
I see. Yeah, thank you so much. A question from another online viewer is, what do you prefer to wear yourself?
What I do I what?
What do you prefer to wear yourself?
Normal stuff.
Okay.
But I prefer some colors, often red, mm-hmm. Sometimes yellow, and this ochre, neutral stuff.
Okay. So another question of an online viewer would be, which colleagues do you appreciate?
Walter de Maria, very close friend, for certain reasons. That's very strange to me. And from the 19th century, my hero is Paul Cézanne.
Okay. Another question, what do you think about the art market?
I never was interested in the art market. And I never worked for the art market. That's important for me. Never, ever. And I never would.
Okay. Another question is, do you sometimes fail at something?
Well, when I develop these works, like the wall formation, I do so precise drawings, narratively, also in color. And I never make mock-ups. I develop them by drawing. They are, for me, so precise that I can decide on hand of the drawings whether it's valid to realize it or not. So in that sense, I never failed. It was a big word, but
what was
that
your,
means,
yeah.
sorry, I say, I never had to throw away a piece because I failed.
So a last question from an online viewer is, do you have any interests besides art?
Cooking.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Franz, for all these answers and for allowing our audience to get in touch with you so closely. Now we come to our last item on the program, another live activation with Lehmann Walter, the son of Franz. He just arrived and will personally activate the work Cold Steel piece from 1969. And maybe you can tell us what is so special about this work and how it functions.
Well, first, another definition of the idea of sculpture, you know. Time is part of it. It's really a sculptural thing. You develop it. You have to make decisions concerning what plate you take first. So you create relation of proportion in time and space. The body is in the center, and as I said before to a question, the body, as you can see it, is material. Time is material, and also the space, if you want to. In this moment, maybe the acoustic moment creates a base. It's quite a complex thing of the idea of sculpture. And done in '69, you know, that was something for me. It also was an answer to the art situation of that time. It was the high time, still the high time of the pop art, and the time when the conceptual art came up, you know. And they criticized, some of them criticized my work, especially Joseph Kosuth. He said, he used the metaphor, it smells too much. I mean, they want to have it pure, black and white. So my answer was, conceptual is wonderful, but it's the bones. But the bones need flesh. So he looked at me and was laughing. So it was my answer, this momentum of, it is conceptual, but at the moment also it's related to terms of art history, sculpture, time, space, material, in another definition as it had been done in history before. That was my aim.
Franz, once again, thank you so much. It's highly appreciated that you made your way to Munich in this demanding situation. And to all of you...
Thank you for the invitation.
Thanks, Franz. And to our online audience, we wish you now a wonderful activation of the Cold Steel piece with Lehmann Walter. Thank you so much.